For Crema Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dlamini. Global Initiative Director Mark Shaw discusses his book titled Hitmen for Hire, Exposing South Africa's Underworld. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you.
Your book exposes the underworld of hitmen in South Africa. What prompted you to tackle this subject?
In fact, the book started as a look at the underworld as a whole. And so looking at different illicit markets in different places, and I was working on that at the University of Cape Town. But it was a very difficult story to tell. And so we began recording hits in the underworld as they related to the unfolding sort of political economy of South Africa, tracing it from 2000. And that became a kind of portal, a symbol, if you like, of the underworld. So I decided to tell the story through that means. So the book is about the underworld. There's a lot about underworld markets, but it's also about how those markets are regulated through the use of violence and through the use of hits.
Going back to the work that you did at the University of Cape Town, what do you think the issue of hitmen, why do you think is it suddenly now booming in South Africa?
I mean, I think the interesting point is it's more visible in the media, but on the data that we have, and what we did is we used a methodology to collect data of hits historically from 2000. In fact, the phenomena is not new. It has changed over time. It is true now that there's an upswing, particularly in relation to political hits. But if you look at the data, which is in the back of the book, you'll see that the phenomena has been present for a fair period in South Africa, and it's related to particular industries. And so the data we collected tried to isolate what the book calls the sort of nurseries of violence, and so where have hitmen graduated from? How has this phenomena grown in the context of South Africa?
You must have been experienced in this kind of field. Do you have any suggestions on how government should tackle this issue?
I mean, my view on the hitman issue, I have a very strong view that we really do need a criminal justice response to the issue. We have been trying to follow up individual cases to see the success rate in terms of prosecutions and investigations, and the success rate is not good. And so I think a simple solution, at least in the short term, is a more effective criminal justice, crime intelligence focus on those issues. In the longer term, there has to be a focus on those industries, both criminal, grey, and legal, that have generated a culture of violence. And if you look at the book, you'll see that the taxi industry, over half the hits that we record since 2000 are related to contestation in the taxi industry, fights over routes, positions in associations. And that's parallels other criminal markets elsewhere in the world. It suggests a degree the urgency of effective state regulation of those markets. It shows how violence is in the DNA of that particular industry amongst others, and how it is spread into, if you like, the crossover between politics, economics and crime. And I think that's a lot of what we are seeing now in the run-up to the election.
Yesterday we saw a very shocking, I'm not sure if you saw it, a video of the bodyguards from KZN who were showing up those big guns as if they were ready to go and kill someone. Do you think most of these hits are always politically connected right now?
No. Hits are, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal, are really an overlay between business, politics and crime. And it's sometimes difficult to isolate which is the stronger player in the mix. The issue of bodyguards is interesting because the book makes the argument that bodyguards are often involved in the hits themselves. I haven't seen this particular video, I should immediately say. What hits allows is a kind of commercialization of violence, and it's sort of sunk into the body politic of the country. It allows me to contract a killer to carry out an act which helps me either politically, commercially, economically within the space. And the book really explores that transaction, how much it costs, where hitmen come from, and where this phenomena developed. My overall argument is, of course, that this is hugely dangerous for democracy, that people being targeted, and there are lots of cases we have collected information in terms of our project at UCT around lots of individual cases. Many people, there's a story of a lady in KwaZulu-Natal at the end of the book who's really a good person, doing very good in her community, etc. But she's targeted for a hit because she's politically threatening. And so these kinds of, the ease with which these transactions for violence are done, I think is the shocking message of the book, and it's really something that that needs to be acted against.
It also came to me as a shock, like in the first chapters of the book where you were speaking to this lady who was also involved in this kind of crime.
Yeah.
Why do you think women are also involved?
Women are clearly a minority, and in this particular case, explained in where the book opens, I wanted to use that case for a number of reasons. Firstly, I wanted to make the argument that the stereotype of the Hollywood hit man or woman is really partly a myth. Of course, in the context of South Africa, there are some practiced hitmen. I mean, that's clear both from the data and from what the book talks about. But here was a very vulnerable woman who had been raped, who was drawn into hits both in the gang turf of the Western Cape, which is of course a very violent space, the association with the taxi industry. So I wanted to demonstrate and in a way shock the reader going in as to how complex this phenomena is. And also, and I hope that comes through the book, that's for the reader to decide, is how vulnerable many of the people carrying out hits are. So this idea that they are driving fast black cars with automatic weapons, there's one theme or there's one story to that, but many of them are deeply troubled, very vulnerable, excluded people. And Layla, as the lady is called in the front of the book, fits that characteristic. She's grown up in a very excluded, isolated, gang-soaked environment. She has been subject to a lot of violence herself.
Yeah. Hitmen for Hire takes the reader on a journey like no other, navigating a world of paid hitmen, informers, rogue policemen, criminal taxi bosses, gang leaders, and crooked politicians, and even businessmen. Going back to the questions, Mark, you were recently quoted saying that the bulk of assassinations in our country are a result of the taxi bosses, of taxi violence, I mean, as you've said. But you also went on to say that increasingly hitmen were being, the taxi hitmen were being used in political killings. Why do you think it's always the case that most of them are from the taxi?
I think, I mean, in terms of doing interviews with people in and around the industry and in people engaged in this business, essentially what's happened is that a number of particular industries generated violent actors over the last 2 decades. And the taxi industry was one of those. The taxi industry needed people to protect routes. Taxi bosses needed bodyguards. There were guns available. And so the taxi industry became and taxi bosses became powerful figures in some communities. They accumulated resources, they supported local politicians, and it's really an underexplored aspect of the local political economy of politics in South Africa. So I think the taxi industry has been a source of violence. And I must say, when we began to collect the data, I didn't anticipate that. You know, we classified the data as hits related to the taxi business, organized crime, the economy, politics, and then personal. And just a shocking number that emerged from the taxi industry, around half, depends year on year, I think demonstrates that very well. And in interviews, people made the point that when hitmen were sourced, they often had been associated, were linked to taxi bosses or the taxi industry.
Is there any information that you would like to share with us that also surprised you while you were doing this research?
I think when you read further into the book, so the book looks at the issue of hits, but as you go deeper into the book, it looks in a great deal of detail at a series of criminal economies, including the gangs in the Western Cape, because a lot of violence emanates from them. And I think the surprising thing for me was, and I tried hard to kind of pull it together at the end of the book, to look at the symbiosis between policing, the state, and the nature of the underworld. So looking at the nature of crime intelligence, the degree that prominent people within the underworld are also informants for crime intelligence. And what does this mean for how we tackle and how we respond to these issues? And that really surprised me. And one of the issues that for me is important to take from the book is this grey space between, I think when we talk about the underworld, we often refer to a place hidden away,
Yes.
but in fact the underworld is quite well stitched into the upper world in a variety of ways, and that shouldn't surprise us. It's not unique to South Africa, but it poses real challenges when violence, mafia-style violence, which hits are, affect the upper world, affect politics, affect economics, and affect community life. And I guess overall that big point shocked me at the end, and so the book is focused on making that point as clearly as I can.
Were you not afraid of meeting some of these like scary people from the underworld?
Firstly, my job is a criminologist, so I am. It is to research crime and criminal activity, and I think without meeting people who are active in the space,
Yes.
I wouldn't be doing my job properly. Secondly, I think researchers have a relatively privileged space in this dynamic, partly because my job is not to, as a journalist would be, or a police investigator, to expose an individual murder. My job is to tell the story of the system, the sort of political economy of violence in this case. And then I think makes a researcher like me and others less threatening. That doesn't mean that everybody wants to speak to you. It means still taking care, meeting in public places and doing sensible things. But the research of organized crime and criminal markets is essential to expose it, as the book says, and to explain it, and to talk around policy options. So to answer your question, yes, there's a kind of uneasy feel around some of these issues, but people from the underworld are often very smart. They want to talk about their lives, and I want to listen and to trace their story into the book. In the end, I did not use a lot of interviews because there wasn't space, and I selected some people like the front, and there are several interviews, as you saw, because I wanted to tell a particular angle of the story. But overall, it is based very much on talking to people active in this particular political economy of violence.
So, Mark, what kind of criticism have you received since the book has been out?
To be honest, none. There's been some very positive reviews. There was I was quoted in one newspaper. There was one small thing saying "Hitmen are human too." My point was, of course, to show that this is an economy which draws on people who are often troubled and isolated. And the only criticism I can think of was somebody criticized that. And in a way, I understand that. There's a sense of, are you humanizing hitmen? That's not the point of the book in any way. The point is to show how this economy of violence has developed and how deeply troubling it is for our society. And I hope that the book has that impact.
Thank you very much, Mark, for
My
your
pleasure.
time. That was Mark Shaw speaking to Crima Media's Polity about his book titled Hitmen for Hire, Exposing South Africa's Underworld.